Some places aren't abandoned. They're waiting for someone who still knows how to listen. The listing had been buried 3 pages deep between broken trailers and foreclosed storage units. The kind of thing most people scrolled past without a second thought. But Daniel Hayes had stopped when he saw the words Cold War Bunker, $1,000. As if something beneath those letters had reached through the screen and tapped gently against whatever remained of his instinct. And 2 days later he was driving north in a rusted pickup that rattled with every mile, the heater coughing warm air in. Uneven breaths while winter pressed cold fingers against the glass. And beside him sat Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver-gray coat and steady amber eyes. Ears flicking now and then toward sounds Daniel couldn't hear, as though the world was speaking on a frequency reserved only for creatures who still trusted their senses. The road narrowed into gravel, then into something that barely deserved to be called a road at all, winding through acres of frozen brush and skeletal trees, until the property line appeared as nothing more than a leaning post and a strip of rusted wire. And beyond it, half sunken into the earth like a memory the land had tried to forget, sat the bunker, its steel door dark with age, edges rimmed in frost, a concrete shell swallowed by decades of wind and silence. And for a long moment Daniel didn't move, his hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the structure as if it might disappear if he blinked. Because places like this didn't usually come with second chances, they came with echoes, with the weight of things left behind. Rex shifted first, letting out a low breath, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, just something older, something instinctive. And when Daniel finally stepped out, his boots crunching against the thin crust of snow, the air carried that faint metallic scent of old iron and still water, the kind of smell that clung to places sealed off from time. And the closer they walked, the more the silence seemed to change, not louder, not softer, just denser, like it was holding something in place. The door resisted at first, hinges stiff from years of neglect, but then it gave with a slow, reluctant groan that echoed deeper than it should have, the sound traveling down into the unseen spaces below. And as the darkness inside opened before them, Daniel felt it, that subtle shift in the air pressure, the way the cold seemed to settle differently here, wrapping around him instead of passing through. And Rex stopped at the threshold, body still, ears forward, eyes locked somewhere beyond the immediate darkness, not afraid, not aggressive, just focused. Listening in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten slightly, because he had seen that posture before, not in bunkers, but in places where something unseen had already begun to move. "You hear something, boy?" he murmured, though he already knew the answer wasn't meant for him. And Rex didn't bark, didn't step back, just tilted his head ever so slightly, as if aligning himself with a rhythm that hadn't revealed itself yet. And after a second, Daniel stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through dust-heavy air, revealing concrete walls marked with faded stencils, numbers and symbols from another era, a narrow corridor stretching forward with the kind of precision only military design could produce. And beneath his boots, just for a fraction of a second, there was something else, something so faint it could have been imagination, a subtle tremor, like the ghost of a pulse traveling through the floor, gone before he could be sure it had ever been there at all. But Rex had already noticed, his paw lifting slightly, head turning toward the wall as if something on the other side had just taken a breath. Daniel did not move right away because something about the air inside the bunker felt structured, not empty, as if silence itself had been arranged with purpose. And when he took another step forward, the beam of his flashlight revealed more of the corridor, long and narrow, lined with metal conduits that traced along the walls like veins frozen in time, each one coated in a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed for decades. Yet the floor beneath his boots felt subtly different, not loose, not broken, just responsive, like it remembered weight. Rex followed slowly now, no longer at Daniel's side but a few feet ahead, his posture low and deliberate, every step measured, ears angled forward in that quiet concentration that always came before he understood something Daniel could not. And then it happened again, faint but unmistakable. A soft vibration beneath the concrete, not strong enough to shake anything loose, just enough to be felt rather than heard. A steady pulse that lingered for a second before fading back into stillness. And Daniel stopped, instinct pulling him back into a version of himself he had not used in years, The part that listened first and questioned later. The part that knew patterns mattered. He crouched slightly, placing his gloved hand against the wall, expecting cold, expecting stillness, but instead there was a subtle hum beneath his palm, so faint it almost slipped past his senses, yet consistent enough to make his breath slow as he waited, counting without realizing he was counting, 1, 2, 3, until it came again, that same quiet pulse traveling through the structure. And this time Rex reacted before it even finished, his head turning sharply toward the right side of the corridor, eyes narrowing, body going completely still except for the slow movement of his chest. All right, Daniel whispered, more to steady himself than anything else, and they moved together toward the direction Rex had chosen, deeper into the bunker where the air grew cooler and carried a different scent, not just metal now, but something older, like sealed rooms and forgotten machinery. And as they turned a corner, the corridor opened into a wider chamber, the ceiling lower, reinforced with thick beams that cast long shadows in the flashlight's glow, and along one wall sat a row of panels. Switches and dials frozen in place, labels faded but still legible in parts, emergency power, ventilation override, signal relay, words from another time when this place had been built for waiting rather than living. Rex ignored all of it, moving straight across the room until he stopped near a section of wall that looked no different from the rest, smooth concrete, slightly darker with age, yet he stood there with quiet certainty, nose close but not touching, as if the space itself was speaking to him in a language that did not require sound. And then the pulse came again, stronger this time, not louder, just closer, traveling through the floor and up the wall beneath Rex's gaze, and Daniel felt it too. A steady rhythm that did not belong to wind or settling stone, something too precise, too deliberate, and without thinking he counted again, slower this time, more focused, until the next pulse arrived exactly where he expected it, the interval unchanged, the pattern unbroken. He exhaled slowly, the realization settling in not as fear, but as something heavier, something closer to recognition, because random things did not repeat like this. Not with this kind of consistency, and when he swept the flashlight across the wall again he noticed it. Not a door, not a seam in the usual sense, but a barely visible outline, a rectangle set into the concrete with edges so fine they had been designed not to be seen unless someone knew where to look, and Rex lifted his paw, pressing it gently against that exact spot, as if confirming what Daniel had only begun to understand, and for a moment neither of them moved. The bunker holding its breath around them, the pulse building again beneath the surface, waiting for the exact second to return. The moment the pulse returned, the wall responded, not with sound but with movement so subtle it felt like a breath drawn deep within the concrete, and Daniel watched as a thin line traced itself along the surface, a seam revealing itself not by force but by timing, as if the structure had been waiting for that exact interval to unlock something it had kept hidden for decades. And Rex did not flinch, his paw still resting against the spot, his body steady, eyes fixed with that same quiet certainty that had guided them here. And when the seam widened just enough to be seen, Daniel stepped closer, his flashlight catching the edges of a panel that began to shift inward with a slow, deliberate motion, no grinding, no resistance, just a smooth glide that felt far too precise for something abandoned this long. The air changed immediately, a faint current slipping through the opening, warmer than the corridor behind them, carrying with it a different scent, one that did not belong to rust or decay, but to something preserved, something sealed away carefully rather than forgotten. And Daniel hesitated for only a second before reaching forward, his hand pressing lightly against the panel as it completed its movement, revealing a narrow passage descending at a slight angle, lined with metal walls that reflected his light in muted, dull tones. And beneath his boots the floor felt different again. Not raw concrete this time, but something engineered, something designed for endurance. Rex moved first, stepping through the opening without hesitation, his nails clicking softly against the surface as he advanced a few feet ahead, then paused, looking back just long enough to confirm Daniel was following. And together they entered the passage, the panel sliding shut behind them with a quiet finality that made the bunker above feel suddenly distant, like a memory sealed off from what lay ahead. The descent was not steep, but it carried them deeper than Daniel expected, the air growing stiller with each step, yet never stale, as if something within this hidden space continued to regulate itself. And after several yards the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the one above but far more intact, the walls clean, the floor free of debris, and along the far side stood a series of consoles, their surfaces worn but not deteriorated. Small indicator lights embedded within them flickering faintly, not bright, not fully alive, but not dead either. Caught somewhere between past and present, Daniel's breath slowed as he approached, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes as he realized what he was seeing was not just a relic, but a system that had never fully stopped, something that had endured quietly beneath layers of time, continuing its function without needing to be witnessed. And then the pulse came again, stronger here, more defined. A steady rhythm that traveled through the room like a signal waiting to be understood, and Rex reacted. Instantly, stepping toward a central console where a single screen, no larger than a notebook, flickered with a dim, intermittent light, the display too faint to read at first, yet unmistakably active. And when Daniel moved closer, wiping a layer of dust from the surface with his sleeve, the screen responded, the glow stabilizing just enough to reveal lines, patterns, something structured, something repeating, not random static, but information, organized and deliberate. He leaned in, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it, the shapes unfamiliar yet purposeful, and beneath his hand the console vibrated gently in sync with the pulse, as if the entire system was built around that rhythm, as if it was not simply operating but communicating. And for a moment Daniel felt something he had not felt in years, not fear, not even curiosity, but a quiet recognition, the sense that he had not stumbled upon this by accident, that the bunker had not simply been waiting for anyone, but for someone willing to notice the pattern, someone willing to follow a signal that most would have ignored. And beside him Rex sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the screen, ears forward, completely still, as if listening not just to the sound, but to what lay beneath it, something older than the bunker itself, something that had finally found someone ready to hear it. Daniel did not touch the screen right away because something about the way it flickered suggested it was not waiting for input, but for recognition, and the patterns that moved across it carried a rhythm that matched the pulse beneath his feet, each line appearing and fading in steady intervals, as if synchronized with something deeper than the system itself. And when he leaned closer, he noticed that the shapes were not random symbols, but structured sequences, repeating in cycles that mirrored the exact timing he had been counting since they first stepped inside. 27 seconds between each shift, precise and unwavering. And that precision settled into him like a memory he could not fully place, something from another time when timing meant survival and patterns meant truth. Rex remained perfectly still beside him, eyes fixed on the screen, ears angled forward, his breathing slow and controlled, not tense but attentive. And then the dog let out a soft, low sound, not a growl, not a bark, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if confirming that what they were seeing was not just machinery, but something intentional, something that had been waiting to be understood rather than simply discovered. Daniel exhaled slowly and reached forward, his fingers brushing against the edge of the console, expecting the cold stillness of dead equipment, but instead the surface carried a faint warmth, subtle yet undeniable, like something that had never fully gone dormant. And the moment his hand made contact, the screen responded, the flickering stabilizing into clearer lines, the patterns shifting into a new sequence that felt less like noise and more like language. And for a brief second the entire room seemed to align with it, the pulse beneath the floor, the faint hum in the walls, the light on the display, all moving in quiet agreement. He swallowed, his mind working through possibilities, none of them fully fitting what he was seeing. Because systems did not sustain themselves like this without maintenance, without oversight, and yet everything here suggested continuity, as if the bunker had been designed not just to endure, but to continue communicating long after its builders were gone. And that thought settled into him with a weight that was not fear, but something closer to responsibility. Rex shifted then, standing slowly and stepping closer to the console, his nose hovering just above the screen without touching it, his head tilting slightly as if following the movement of the patterns. And then he lifted his paw again, placing it gently on the lower panel beneath the display, And the reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in the room as another section of the console lit up, faint indicators glowing to life one by one. Each pulse now accompanied by a soft tone, almost like a heartbeat given sound. Daniel felt it in his chest, not physically but somewhere deeper, the way certain sounds could resonate beyond hearing. And as he watched the screen more closely, he began to notice something else, something hidden within the repetition, slight variations that formed a sequence, not random but deliberate, a pattern within the pattern, and slowly, almost without realizing it, he began to understand that this was not just a signal but a message, something encoded in timing and structure rather than words, something that required patience rather than translation. The air in the chamber felt different now, not colder, not warmer, but aware, as if the space itself recognized that it was no longer alone, and Daniel straightened slightly, his eyes moving from the screen to the walls, to the ceiling, to the faint lines of conduits that seemed to carry the pulse throughout the entire structure. And for the first time since stepping into the bunker, he did not feel like an intruder. He felt like a participant, someone who had been drawn here not by chance, but by the simple act of paying attention. Rex sat back down beside him, calm and steady, his presence grounding the moment in something real, something trustworthy, and Daniel nodded faintly, more to himself than to the dog, as if accepting something he could not yet fully explain, because whatever this place was, whatever it had been built to do, it had not stopped, and now, after all these years, it was no longer waiting in silence. Daniel stayed where he was, his hand resting lightly against the console as the faint glow continued to shift across the screen, because the more he watched, the clearer it became that the pattern was not just repeating but evolving, each cycle carrying a slight variation, a subtle adjustment that felt less like a machine looping and more like something adapting, and that realization settled into him slowly, like a truth that did not rush but waited to be accepted. The pulse beneath the floor no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt present, deliberate, as if it was guiding the rhythm of everything around them, and Rex responded to it in ways that Daniel could only begin to understand, the dog's ears adjusting with each interval, his head turning slightly before each pulse arrived, anticipating it with a precision that spoke of recognition rather than surprise. And then, as the next cycle completed, the screen shifted again, the lines reorganizing into a formation that was more structured than anything Daniel had seen so far, columns and sequences aligning in a way that suggested meaning, not language in the traditional sense, but something closer to coordinates, or memory mapped in a time instead of space. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes tracing the movement carefully, and without thinking he reached for the side panel, brushing away more dust until a set of engraved markings became visible, small, worn letters etched into the metal. Emergency Relay Protocol. Below them a series of numbers that mirrored the intervals he had been counting, and he felt a quiet shift inside himself as those details connected, not fully, not yet, but enough to suggest that this system had been built with intention far beyond simple shelter, that it had been designed to send something, or perhaps to preserve something until the right moment returned. Rex moved again, stepping away from the console and pacing slowly along the edge of the chamber, his nose low, tracing the air, rather than the ground. And then he stopped near the far wall where a narrow vertical seam ran from floor to ceiling, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, and Daniel followed, his flashlight revealing a second panel, smaller than the first but built with the same precision. And as the next pulse passed through the room, the seam responded, not opening yet, but shifting ever so slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. The air grew still again, the kind of stillness that carried weight rather than emptiness, and Daniel placed his hand against the wall, feeling the faint vibration travel through the structure, steady, unwavering, and for the first time he understood that this was not a dormant system waiting to be activated. It was an active one waiting to be understood, something that had continued its purpose long after the world above had forgotten it existed. He stepped back just enough to take in the entire room, the consoles, the faint lights, the hidden seams, all of it connected by that quiet, persistent rhythm, and a thought settled into him, simple but undeniable, that whatever had been built here was not meant to be found by accident. It required patience, attention, and the willingness to trust what could not yet be explained. Rex sat again near the second seam, his body relaxed but alert, eyes fixed on the exact point where the wall had shifted, and when the next pulse came, he lifted his paw slowly, placing it against the surface with the same calm certainty he had shown before, and this time the response was immediate, the seam widening just enough to reveal a thin line of light from within, soft and steady, not flickering like the consoles but constant, as if whatever lay beyond had never dimmed. Daniel felt his breath steady as he stepped forward, not with hesitation but with a quiet acceptance, because the deeper they went, the clearer it became that this place was not something to fear. It was something to listen to, something that had been speaking all along, waiting for someone who would not ignore the signal. And as the narrow opening expanded just enough to allow passage, the light from within reached out into the chamber, gentle but unmistakable, like a message finally crossing the distance it had been holding for years. Daniel stepped through the narrow opening slowly, the light beyond neither harsh nor dim, but steady in a way that felt deliberate, as if it had been held at that exact intensity for years without wavering. And the moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed again, warmer now, not by much but enough to be felt against his skin, carrying a faint scent that was unfamiliar in a place like this, something clean, almost like aged paper and dry wood rather than metal and dust, and behind him the panel remained open, not sealing them in, but holding its position as if allowing the past and present to exist side by side. Rex moved ahead with quiet confidence, his steps measured but no longer cautious, his ears relaxed yet attentive, and as they entered the hidden chamber fully, Daniel's flashlight became unnecessary, because the room itself provided its own illumination, soft strips of light embedded along the walls, their glow consistent and calm, revealing a space unlike anything above, smaller than the main bunker, but far more complete, every surface intact, every object placed with intention rather than abandonment. Along the walls were shelves, not cluttered but organized, holding sealed containers, labeled with dates that stretched back decades, each one preserved in a way that suggested care rather than urgency, and in the center of the room stood a single structure, a table or console unlike the others, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a thin rectangular panel set into its center, and beneath it the pulse was strongest, no longer faint but clearly defined, a steady rhythm that seemed to rise up from the floor and settle into the air itself. Daniel approached slowly, his eyes taking in every detail, the absence of decay, the quiet order of the space, the unmistakable sense that this room had not been forgotten but protected, and as he reached the central structure, Rex circled once before sitting beside it, his gaze fixed not on the surroundings but on the panel itself, as if he already understood that this was where the signal led. Daniel placed his hand lightly on the surface, and the response came immediately, the panel illuminating beneath his touch, not flashing or alarming, but waking, a soft glow spreading across it in the same rhythm as the pulse, and then, gradually, the surface shifted, revealing a display beneath, clearer than the one before, more defined, lines forming into shapes that held meaning even before they were fully understood, and as Daniel leaned closer, he realized that what he was seeing was not just data or code. It was something structured like a record, a sequence of stored moments, preserved not in images but in patterns of time and repetition, the pulse aligned with the display perfectly now, each interval triggering a new sequence, each sequence building upon the last, and Daniel felt a quiet stillness settle into him as he watched, because this was not random, this was deliberate, something designed to be read not with words but with attention, something that required presence rather than interpretation. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer to Daniel's side, his body calm, grounded, and Daniel rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth there, the simple certainty of something alive and real in a place that felt almost suspended outside of time. And for a moment he closed his eyes, just long enough to listen, not to the hum of machinery, not to the faint sound of the bunker above, but to the rhythm itself, the steady, unchanging pulse that had guided them here. And in that moment, he understood something that did not need to be explained, that whatever had been built in this place was not meant to be hidden forever. It was meant to endure until someone arrived who would not rush past it, someone who would stay long enough to notice that it was still speaking. When he opened his eyes again, the display had shifted once more, the patterns forming into something simpler now, less complex, almost as if the system was adjusting to him, meeting him where he was instead of expecting him to understand everything at once. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that carried something new with it. Not relief, not excitement, but a sense of alignment, as if for the first time in a long while. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and beside him Rex remained still, eyes steady, listening not just to the sound, but to the meaning that lived within it. The patterns continued to unfold across the surface in steady, deliberate intervals, and the longer Daniel watched, the less they felt like something distant and mechanical, and the more they felt like something being revealed step by step, as if the system understood that understanding itself could not be rushed, and so it slowed, simplifying the sequences into clearer forms, repeating certain structures just long enough for recognition to take hold before shifting again, and Daniel found himself leaning closer without realizing it, his breathing matching the rhythm beneath the floor, his mind no longer trying to decode everything at once, but instead following the movement as it came, one cycle at a time. Rex remained at his side, unmoving except for the subtle tilt of his head with each pulse, his ears adjusting slightly before each interval, as though he could sense the shift before it arrived. And then, as the next sequence appeared, something changed, not in the intensity of the light or the speed of the pattern, but in its shape, the lines forming into a structure that held a kind of familiarity. Not words, not images exactly, but something closer to a map, or perhaps a memory translated into motion, and Daniel felt it then, that quiet moment when recognition begins before explanation, the sense that what he was seeing was not entirely new, just something he had forgotten how to recognize. He straightened slightly, his eyes tracing the repeating forms, and then he noticed the consistency within them, the way certain sequences aligned with others, the way the timing between shifts created a structure that extended beyond the screen itself, connecting back to the pulse beneath the room. And for a moment he closed his eyes again, letting the visual patterns fall away so he could focus only on the rhythm, counting without numbers, feeling the intervals instead of measuring them. And in that quiet space something settled into place, not as a full understanding, but as a direction, a sense that the system was not asking to be solved, but to be followed. When he opened his eyes again, the display had changed once more, the patterns narrowing into a single sequence that repeated more slowly now, each interval longer, more deliberate, and as it cycled again and again, Daniel realized that the system was no longer presenting information. It was waiting for a response, not through buttons or switches, but through presence, through the simple act of staying and observing. And that realization shifted something inside him, something that had been shaped by years of moving forward, of leaving places behind before they could ask anything more of him. Rex stood then, moving a few steps closer to the central structure, his paw lifting once more, but this time he did not press it down immediately. Instead he hovered there for a second, as if waiting for the exact moment, and when the pulse reached its peak, he placed it gently against the panel, and the effect was immediate yet calm, the display brightening slightly, the sequence stabilizing into a new form, one that no longer shifted with each cycle but held steady, as if the system had accepted the interaction and moved to the next stage. Daniel felt a quiet exhale leave his chest, not forced, not conscious, just a release of something he had been holding without knowing it. And as he looked at the now stable pattern, he saw it more clearly, a structure that extended beyond the screen, beyond the room, something that suggested continuity rather than isolation, as if this bunker, this hidden space beneath layers of earth and time, was not an endpoint but part of something larger, something that connected across distances not measured in miles but in moments, in signals sent and received across years that had passed unnoticed. The room felt different again now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the purpose within it had shifted from waiting to recognition, and Daniel placed his hand fully on the surface of the central structure, no longer testing, no longer hesitant, just present, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not feel like he was uncovering something hidden. He felt like he was answering something that had been reaching out all along, something that had continued to speak even when no one was listening. And beside him Rex sat once more, calm and steady, his gaze no longer searching but settled, as if the message that had drawn them here had finally found its mark. The pattern did not disappear after it stabilized. It deepened, and as Daniel kept his hand against the surface, the steady glow beneath his palm began to shift outward, extending beyond the central panel and into the surrounding structure, faint lines illuminating beneath the surface like veins of light awakening after years of silence. And for a moment the entire chamber seemed to breathe in unison, the pulse no longer confined to the floor, but rising gently through the walls and ceiling, forming a quiet network of connection that made the space feel larger than it physically was. Rex lifted his head slightly, not startled, not tense, but aware, his ears turning in slow, precise adjustments as if tracking something moving beyond the room itself, something distant yet connected, and Daniel followed that instinct, his gaze drifting upward as the faint illumination traced paths along the ceiling, forming patterns that extended outward, not random, not decorative, but directional, like routes mapped across an invisible landscape. And suddenly the realization came not as a shock, but as a quiet unfolding, that this place had never been meant to stand alone, that what he was seeing was part of a system that reached beyond this bunker, beyond this stretch of land, something designed to connect points across distance using nothing but rhythm and time. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling into him. Because this was not about hidden wealth or forgotten machinery. It was something far more enduring, a network built not to store power or weapons, but to preserve communication, to ensure that something meaningful could continue even when everything else above had changed. And as the lines of light continued to expand, the central display shifted once more, the stable pattern breaking into a broader structure, one that mirrored what now traced along the walls, a map not of geography, but of connection, each node represented by a pulse, each interval marking a link between places that might have been separated by miles or even states, yet united through this silent language. Rex stood and took a few slow steps in a small circle, his movements calm but purposeful, as if aligning himself with the flow of something larger, and then he stopped, facing the central structure again, his posture relaxed, his tail still, and Daniel understood that the dog was no longer searching. He was listening, not for something new, but for something that had finally become clear. Daniel removed his hand briefly, watching as the glow remained steady without him, the system no longer requiring contact to continue, and he stepped back just enough to see the full chamber, the illuminated lines, the quiet order, the sense of continuity that now filled the space. And for the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to consider what this meant beyond the moment, that somewhere, perhaps miles away, there could be another place like this, another structure waiting in silence, sending or receiving the same steady rhythm. And that possibility did not feel distant or abstract. It felt immediate, as if the connection already existed and he had simply stepped into it. The air carried that same calm warmth, unchanged, and the pulse continued, unwavering, no longer something to question but something to accept. And Daniel felt a quiet shift within himself, a release of the constant forward motion that had defined his life for so long, replaced by something slower, something more grounded, the understanding that not everything needed to be chased or solved, some things only needed to be recognized and held. Rex returned to his side and sat, his body leaning slightly into Daniel's leg, a simple, steady presence that anchored the moment, and Daniel rested his hand gently on the dog's back, feeling the warmth and the quiet strength there. And as he looked once more at the illuminated patterns stretching across the room, he realized that whatever this place had been built to do, it had not failed. It had endured, patiently, silently, until someone arrived who would not overlook it. Someone who would stay long enough to understand that the signal had never stopped. It had only been waiting for the right listener to hear it again. Daniel did not rush to leave because something in the rhythm of that place had already begun to reshape the way he measured time. And standing there beside the steady glow, with Rex pressed quietly against his leg, he understood that the discovery was not something that ended in a single moment, but something that would continue long after they stepped back into the cold air above, because what they had found was not a secret meant to be taken. It was a signal meant to be kept. The chamber remained calm around them, the lines of light no longer expanding but holding their form with quiet certainty, as if the system had completed what it needed to do for now. And Daniel slowly removed his hand from the surface, not because he had to, but because he sensed that the connection no longer required contact, that whatever had been recognized would not be lost the moment he stepped away. Rex rose as well, stretching once before turning toward the narrow passage they had entered through, his movements unhurried, confident, no longer searching for anything more, and Daniel followed, taking one last look at the chamber, the preserved shelves, the steady lights, the central structure that now felt less like a machine and more like something entrusted, something that had carried its purpose through years of silence and had finally been acknowledged. As they moved back through the passage, the air gradually shifted again, the warmth fading into the cooler stillness of the upper bunker, yet the pulse remained, softer now, less pronounced, but still present beneath his feet, like a memory that would not disappear. And when they stepped back into the larger chamber, the consoles above seemed different, not because they had changed, but because he had. The faded labels and quiet surfaces no longer signs of abandonment, but of continuity, pieces of a system that had never truly gone dormant. Daniel walked slowly toward the main corridor, Rex moving just ahead, and when they reached the heavy steel door, he paused for a moment, his hand resting against the cold metal as he looked out at the pale winter light beyond, the landscape unchanged, the wind moving gently across the frozen ground as if nothing beneath it had stirred at all. And yet he knew better now, because some things did not need to be visible to remain real. They stepped outside together, the cold air sharp against his face, the silence of the open land wide and familiar, and Rex took a few steps forward before stopping and looking back, not with urgency, not with concern, but with a quiet steadiness that mirrored everything they had just experienced. And Daniel nodded slightly, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words could hold. Before closing the bunker door behind them, the sound echoing softly, before settling into stillness. The world above continued as it always had, wind moving through dry grass, distant trees standing against the horizon, nothing remarkable to anyone passing by. And yet beneath it all, the rhythm continued, steady and patient, waiting not for discovery, but for recognition. And Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air, feeling something settle into place within him that had been unsettled for years. Not a solution, not an answer, but a sense of alignment, the quiet understanding that he did not need to keep searching for something to change everything. Because sometimes what changes everything is simply learning to listen to what has been there all along. And as he turned to walk back toward the truck, Rex falling into step beside him, the land stretched out ahead, in the same quiet way it always had. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel did not feel like he was passing through it. He felt like he belonged within it, connected not by ownership or direction, but by the simple, steady rhythm of something that endures, something that waits, and something that returns only to those who are willing to stay long enough to hear it.